On today's episode, we hear how trying socialism one more time has no more dire consequences than messing up a souffle. We learn that you can't be a capitalist unless you own a factory and have a monocle and top hat. Find out how freely disseminated speech across the internet is a dictator's dream. Find out that the point of being a landlord is to deny housing. Hear someone else give another shot at the minimum wage argument. And lastly, hear CNN absolutely crumble when put up to the tiniest amount of scrutiny. This is Cringe Posts. Hello friends, welcome to this episode of the Cringe Post podcast. This is the show where we gather the cringiest political and cultural takes in our feeds and in your feeds, and we break down where they went wrong, what underlying assumptions they messed up, and we hope to have a laugh along the way. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt, and before we make fun of other people's bad posts, we always like to take a moment to reflect and look back on our own bad posts. So we'll be getting to a bad take from Britt in a moment here. Before we do that, just want to remind you to like, share, and comment, all that good stuff. It really helps us out, and we appreciate the engagement, helps us grow, and we love to see it. And also to remind you that if you are listening to this in audio version and you want to see the posts that we critique visually, we do have a guide up that you can access on our website at cringeposts.com. Without further ado, let's take a look at this bad post from Britt in May of 2011, where he wrote, "Wallpaper is quite possibly the stupidest invention mankind has made." First of all, I like man space kind.
I know.
Like it's the stupidest invention that a kind man has made, but there have been a lot more stupid inventions.
A man named
what
kind.
spurred this tirade?
I have no idea, but the reason I picked it. So initially, when I saw it, for some reason I didn't see the wall part, so I just saw paper is quite possible. I was like, dude, you did not just say that or think that like 12 years ago. But then, I was happy to see that it was only slightly improved in thinking that wallpaper. And I'm pretty sure it had to do something with I would remodel houses with my parents when I was young, and we'd flip them and stuff. And I'm pretty sure I had to scrape some wallpaper off or something, and I thought it was just so dumb. It's just it's one of those things that's like, ooh, look at me. I've got some special, unique insight that I'm going to put out there into the world. And as most of my takes from this time period, from about 2008 to 2011, it just screams of how can I differentiate myself with some obscure, weird, niche fact or insight? Because no one cares about this. What was the point of saying this? No one cares. And it's wallpaper, I'm pretty sure, is not the stupidest invention mankind has made. There's been a lot of way more stupid things that have been made, and I don't know. At least in some cases, it probably looks good. I don't think they really do wallpaper anymore. But yeah, regardless, it was really popular at one point.
Right. It's kind of a fad, and I mean, in the same way that we can sort of look back and shudder at and cringe at other trends, I guess you can cringe at wallpaper, but it's also the hyperbole, just quite possibly the stupidest invention. Such a mundane thing to call out in such an aggressive way. It kind of makes me laugh because I think I tend to have a similar humor where I would attack things with a ferocity that is really undeserving of such vigor. It's wallpaper. Calm down.
It's wallpaper, but it's also I don't know, to kind of get a little bit deeper on it. It's like don't criticize something that you have not even done something better than, right? I have at 2011. I've since then I've invented a lot of things, but in 2011 I hadn't invented anything. Much less some sort of paper that can be put on a wall and look good, right? And so it's before you criticize the world, as Jordan Peterson would say, clean up your own room. It reminds me, I have this friend.
Plaster it with some wallpaper while you're at it.
Yes, exactly. Make it look good. But I have this friend, and not to deflect from myself, but this is just kind of the same vein. We were watching a UFC fight, and he hadn't really watched it, but he kind of did the classic, well, I'm just too much of an intellectual to enjoy, UFC fighting. I was like, dude, you got to get punched or something, or go box or something. You'll realize what an art it is, and how difficult it is, and how much mental fortitude it takes to do it. And this is just kind of reeked of the same thing, of I'm criticizing something that I don't understand, and I don't have any I don't have any standpoint to criticize someone else's invention when I haven't invented anything myself. I'm the guy there peeling the wallpaper off. I'm not the guy that invented it and sold it to someone, to put on. Once I reach that standpoint, then maybe I can criticize it.
It's funny. I should look back. Now that you bring up this sort of train of thought, I haven't found any old posts of mine that are of this persuasion, but I'm sure I have one where I'm criticizing the sport scene or watching sports or things like that. Too much of an intellectual to watch sports. And it's funny because I've since then I still don't really enjoy watching sports myself, but I don't think it's this cringy, horrible, stupid apex of the decline of the Western civilization like some people really go into. And I realize that there's when people are doing these things, it's an incredible feat most of the time. The athleticism and the skill and the quick thinking and the calculation all play into something that when I don't do that thing, it's hard to appreciate. And so from the outsider, you're like, wow, I can chase a ball around. I am very funny and smart. And it's like, no, there's a lot more going into it. and it's funny. I mean, I'm not totally proud to say what really brought me around is the sort of the advent of streaming and esports, where there was professional people doing things in a field that I felt somewhat competent in, where I'm like, oh, I know how to play Super Smash Brothers, and then seeing a professional do it, and you're like, how are they moving so fast? How are they making these calculations? And then you start to follow players, and you appreciate them for their style and gameplay, and then you take a step back, and you realize, oh, this is what people love about sports. It's just I don't connect with sports because it's not the way that I enjoy. I'll play soccer with friends or whatever, but it's never felt like a thing that's really ignited me or taken my imagination. So nowadays I try to be a lot more diplomatic on sports and things like that. But it's kind of that same thing where, you're looking in and you're criticizing and you're just completely missing what actual value is there and assuming that in your infinite knowledge and wisdom, you've assessed everything. Yep, we can move on from this. Nothing good here. It's stupid.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Moving to our first cringe post from other people of the episode. We have Francesca Fiorentini, who I'm not exactly sure who this is, but
she's a journalist.
She tweets.
From Argentina.
Journal. Oh, okay. There we go. Think of socialism like a fancy baked good. Just because many have made a mess of their kitchen attempting it doesn't mean you go around declaring you'll never eat souffle again. It just means you try harder. I think the best response to this that I saw was the picture and the memes of, well, not even really a meme, just the historic picture of some of the waste and the bones of starvation in these countries, and it was, oops, burn the souffle again, and with literal human bodies there.
Yeah,
and it is such a flippant and I don't want to use the language of the left, but the word that comes to mind is privileged take to compare such real world heavy consequences in such a trite manner to just, oh, you just burned a souffle in the kitchen. You just spilled your flour a little bit and just need to wipe up and try again. No, the exchange of goods that people rely on for a living and the freedoms that they have in order to achieve their dreams and their goals, let alone the dangers of actual starvation, government oppression, and shutdown, and the worst forms. Those aren't trite little trifles to jokingly say, oh, oopsie, gotta do a little cleanup in the kitchen here.
Yeah. What I was thinking when I read it was, think of socialism like a baked good. If you burn it, you still got to eat it because there's no other food left to eat. It's like, what a weird thing to like, I mean, I know it's kind of the joke, but it's also the truth that socialism leads to bread lines and empty shelves of food. So like, how privileged to liken it to a fancy baked good, as she says it, as souffle, and then be like, oh, well, like, you'll just try again. It's like, there's just something so like oblivious there. And then I was looking her up, she's from Argentina. It's like I don't know. Like, think about like Che Guevara, who I know he was in Cuba, but he's from Argentina originally. It's like, when he tried again, tens of thousands of people were died, tortured, or imprisoned. just if she can't look beyond her own, heritage, if she can't look to, Soviet Russia or any of those places. And that's, I guess this is like the classic take of like, well, real socialism hasn't been tried. Yeah, like, right? And it's like, well, after so many different tries, right? Like we tried it and executed it so many times in the 20th century, you start to realize that like, oh, like death, destruction, starvation, and pain is a feature. It's not a bug of the system that you're trying to implement.
Right. I wonder, if we're talking in cheap little witticisms, saying it just means you try harder, at what point do you delve into Einstein's definition of insanity, of trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results? If she wants to go down the oversimplify and make systems of exchange in human affairs into a neat little phrase, that to me seems fairly apt. I just don't get when people acknowledge the failures of socialism, because in my mind, if you acknowledge the failures of the state in this different socialist or Stalinist or Marxist attempts, that's a pretty big burden. Coming from a background in debate, there was often two sort of paths that you could take when you're approaching an issue, right? Where, let's say you're defending an idea of some kind, and your opposition makes a claim that the idea that they are proposing has this negative consequence. And when you're faced with that, you sort of have two options. You can, one, deny it, say, actually, that's not true, and you can dispute it with the facts, or you can say there are other factors that create these bad things, or what have you. Or you can sort of cede the ground. You can say, yes, this bad thing does happen, but what I'm proposing is still worth it because of these reasons. Those are your two options, right? You can either sort of deny and provide evidence as to why what they're claiming is wrong or bad doesn't happen, or you can cede the ground and say that, that is a cost I'm willing to buy it. And when people talk about the real socialism hasn't been tried, or in this case, you just messed up the kitchen a little bit and you need to try again, you're acknowledging that something went wrong somewhere. And in order to acknowledge that, you have to take on the literal lives of thousands and hundreds of thousands of bodies in order to see that something went wrong and something failed. And that's a pretty heavy burden to then say, but in spite of that, it's still worth another try or to reach. And so to me, even that acknowledgement that something went wrong in the kitchen is almost like you have to hide it in the terms of something like this little kitchen metaphor, because if you acknowledge it in any other setting, you're not talking about broken eggshells, you're talking about human bodies.
Totally agree.
All right, so we'll move on to our next post here. This one reads, "Oh, you're a, quote, capitalist, end quote. Please show me the means of production that you own. I'll wait." This one almost to me sounds like someone in a more liberty-minded camp making fun of what someone on the left would say, just because it's just such a silly claim.
It's not, though. I know this person personally, and they mean every word that they say.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess let's, if you ceded that ground here to say I don't own any means of production, let's just say that that's true. Does that mean that I can't support the ideas of capitalism? I don't think that in order to be an ideologue of some kind, you even necessarily have to be that thing. Like in the same way that, I don't agree with the ways that the conservative right supports the troops necessarily, but I also think it would be very dumb to say, oh, you support the troops? Well, how come you're not a soldier? It's like, I think that you could make the argument that you have less authority, you have maybe not as much credential, you can argue that, but you can't say that your viewpoint or the ideas you espouse or believe to be true is invalidated because you're not a member of that party. You could just say that it takes away some credibility or authority. In the same way, that I think, I'm going to listen to a doctor's opinion more than, say, I don't know, a random Wall Street finance guy on the street when it comes to what I should do to feel better if I'm sick. But that doesn't mean that the doctor is always going to be right and the Wall Street guy is always going to be wrong necessarily. It just means that the doctor has more reason to be believed. So even at its best, to me, it doesn't really add up in that way. But obviously, there's more wrong with this.
This one struck me for two reasons. I think the first, and this is an argument that and kind of meme that you might see a lot on the internet from socialist and leftist is, it's like, well, the only reason like you support capitalism is because you think that someday you're going to be in the top whatever percent. Well, newsflash, you're not. And it's like, okay, like that, just because most of us will never occupy the top 1% or whatever it is, which is in fact not true, right? Like the upper echelons of wealth are actually, they're cyclical, right? There's no surprise that the majority of the people in the top 1% are usually older, right? Like they've stacked resources over time. And that people at some point in their lives occupy that top 1%. So that's like a fundamental misunderstanding of some of that. But then two, it's like, who benefits from capitalists and people owning production and making it more efficient and better? It's like, it's the common person. So it's like, yeah, maybe I don't own the means of production. Like semantically, like that's not really a requirement to be a capitalist. Like capitalism is like a theory and an economic system, right? It's like, it's a theory that like, private businesses should be owned by private entities and are best managed by private entities through voluntary exchange and trade. So you don't have to own production to be a capitalist. But then two, even if we granted that, right, where it's like, hey, you have to own production to like be a capitalist, it's like, well, that especially today in this modern age, right, where we've got a laptop and you can make a podcast or you can make some online good, or you have access to all these different things that capitalism has brought. Like you do have access to means of production. Like that's one of the beauties of the 21st century is like the invention of kind of like what is it called? Like they're not the do-it-yourselfer, but like the self-employed person, right? The person that goes and rents a WeWork space and has their own business online on Etsy or whatever, right? So there's just a lot wrong with it, obviously, even when you grant this guy the most like charitable view of the post that he's making. But back to the point that I was trying to make earlier, the capitalism ends up benefiting everyone underneath it, right? And they're going to say, well, you're talking about trickle-down economics. So no, like the most of the wealth that has been made, the great fortunes, whether it's Amazon, Microsoft, anyone, has been made by making services cheaper for people. And when things are cheaper, that means they're easier to obtain. And that, this is one of my favorite examples you've given, is the people that benefited the most from plumbing was not the rich people, it was the poor people, right? Because the rich people had servants that would take out their chamber pots. The poor people had no one. They had to do it themselves. And so these people, it's like, yeah, even if you're not going to occupy the top 1%, you still benefit from there being capitalism because your life is consistently made better. The only way they get rich is by making your life better and the lives of everyday people more better.
And the other aspect too is, maybe they're trying to get you on a only in your worldview kind of trap here, but aren't people and that side generally very much proponents of the idea that you own your own labor? Because in that sense, if you view the world from that lens, wouldn't every individual be his or her own means of production? The production being whatever services you provide. In the same way, you could view every person almost as a self-employed contractor that you make a voluntary agreement with a company, and the contract is, you give me dollar bills, in exchange I will create this service for you, whatever that is, whether that's providing HR for a company or making certain investments for a business, whatever that is. You're providing that service, and so that's a production of its own, especially with people who sort of view the owning your own labor theory of value, which is just kind of funny that these people wouldn't necessarily grant that to a person. So, as a capitalist, I don't view labor as an inherent value unless I'm providing something that people subjectively want, right? I'm not providing actual value unless it's something someone else values, but I do own myself, and I myself am able to create things. And so insofar as I'm able to own my own body and the government doesn't own it of me. I don't know. It seems like I at least have my own means of production, my own ingenuity and creativity at the very, very least.
Yes.
Okie dokie. We'll move on to our next post. And this one, yes, 2 in a row, folks. We've got him back. It's Robert Reich. And yes, he's still on the same topic as the tweet, but this time he's gone and written a full article for The Guardian. You're going to love this headline, and you're going to love the tagline even more. So, Robert Reich's article reads, Elon Musk's vision for the internet is dangerous nonsense. Tagline, Musk has long advocated a libertarian vision of an uncontrolled internet. That's also the dream of every dictator, strongman, and demagogue. Because the number one thing that authoritarian regimes love is free speech, unfettered dissent, and the ability to mass spread it without government control. That, of course, is the dictator and strongman's perfect just utopia of what they want to control. Let's actually look at what dictators do when they come into power. There's a few very similar trends that you can see in history. One, usually they disarm the population. That's one of the first things that they will do. Two, they will control the speech of their population. They will enact things like laws against enemies of the state. So anyone who's propagating viewpoints that are anti-patriotic or against the great state nation, that usually becomes contraband to some degree. They start acquiring the means of production of the ways that you can spread. So that's usually historically printing presses or things like that. They try to own that by the state so that books that they don't want printed don't get printed. Then you usually see book burning or the other kinds of contraband taken away from the population. None of that, to me, speaks of a uncontrolled internet that has the ability to send messages anonymously, has the ability to send messages virally, and the ability to send messages of dissent with very little repercussion. This is just the most backward, unbelievable clown world take, and that's saying something because Robert Reich has quite a few of those.
It's what really gets me, man. This is a quote from the article. He's like, it seems like an odd move for Musk to buy Twitter, who describes himself as a free speech absolutist. Musk advocates free speech, but in reality, it's just about power. And it's like, way to project, dude. Like, you're just projecting, because all you care about is the power to be able to ban and censor people that you want to censor. I don't see Robert Reich writing an article about like the dangers of Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post, because the Washington Post lines up ideologically with what Robert Reich wants, right? And it's like, well, obviously, if you don't have the same standard across all things, it must be about power for you, Robert. It's not actually about some sort of principle. And like we've said in the past, right? Like that's kind of like the key attribute of a lot of like cringe posts is that it's not actually attached to a principle. It's tied to an agenda, or it's tied to wanting to amass power over someone else. And could you imagine like? It's just crazy. We live in a topsy-turvy world right now. Like even 6 years ago, saying like, hey, this person that believes in free speech bought some, a controlling stake in Twitter. Like, I'm worried that there's going to be, less free speech on the platform, or it's going to be really dangerous from that. It's like, I don't know, that people would be pretty skeptical of that, but they have, riled these people up into such like a Trump derangement syndrome that it's like, no, at any cost, we've got to keep Trump off the platform. We've got to keep dangerous people like Alex Jones off the platform, and it's like, and whenever you go back to them and say, well, where does it stop, right? Like you banned Alex Jones. Like, are you going to start banning like sitting, government, Congress people and presidents? And like, no, like that, stop being such like a slippery slope person. Like it's not going to happen. And then what do you know? We've got a sitting president that gets banned. We have sitting Congress people that get banned, as well as anyone with any sort of dissident view. Like, who was it? Defiant L's, who themselves were just posting like pictures of other tweets that were allowed to be up, was banned. So it's like, it's clearly like it's an ideological system. And what's kind of nice is Robert Reich comes out and he basically admits that here, right? That it's like, oh, this is ideologically driven and it's all about power, and I want to have the power, and I don't want to have someone who's willing to like take the reins off that have power. Which in a sense he's saying, for all of his love of democracy, he doesn't want the free market of ideas and the free populace to decide who they listen to or who they don't. He wants to determine who you listen to.
There's a great irony of someone complaining about how freeing up speech is a power move when he himself gets paid in the sums of like $50,000 a speech to go to a private event.
Gosh.
There's something that just puts a little bit of hypocrisy musk in the air, pun intended there. When you hear that kind of thing being spoken about, another line from this article that's just so good is, and this will come into play with our last cringe post here. So just sort of take this nugget and put it in the back of your mind here, and just hold on to it for a bit. In reality, that world, the one of Musk's free internet, would be dominated by the richest and most powerful people in the world who wouldn't be accountable to anyone for facts, truth, science, or the common good. That's Musk's dream, and Trump's, and Putin's. And the dream of every dictator, strongman, demagogue, and modern-day robber baron on Earth. For the rest of us, it would be a brave new nightmare. So the first part, log that back away, saying that they wouldn't be accountable to anyone for facts and truth. Just keep that in mind, hold on to that. And then, of course, he has to throw in Trump and Putin. These people have one obsession, and they cannot, for the life of them, quit it. You guys, they complain about how rich Trump is, and they're literally letting him live rent-free in their heads. He's making a killing off of that, dude. Stop it. Stop pretending that Trump is even anywhere near the level of dictator that Putin is. Stop it. Putin has done numerous things worse than Trump, and you guys pretend that he's even on the same level. And Putin, relative to the tyrants of history, he would be on the lower end, okay? I don't like Putin. I'm not a Putin apologist. I don't think he's a good guy. But to claim that Musk and Trump and Putin are these titans of authoritarianism, and to bring in Trump and Putin in this completely irrelevant article, it's just a complete cheap smear tactic to try to bring up negative emotions and feelings without saying anything of substance.
It's like the Baron Zemo guy from Captain America: Civil War, where it's like he's got like the trigger words for the for the Winter Soldier, and he's like freight car or whatever, and then the guy becomes the Winter Soldier. It's like this guy Robert Reich knows. He's like, if I say Trump and I say Putin and I say Musk and I say demagogues and robber barons, they're gonna get so riled up about it. And it's like who do you think's running Twitter right now, right? Like you've got a rich guy at the top determining who does and does not get to say their piece on social media and broadcast it. And the only reason you're not criticizing it is because you like what they're deciding. And any threat to that, Robert Reich, the guy who's probably richer than basically every other American that you'd ever meet in your normal life, because it threatens your viewpoint, you don't want it to happen. It really says something, I think, too, when there's potentially more free speech for normal people. The America's elite get all flustered. And
to anyone maybe moderate or left of center that's happening to hear this, just remember that Robert Reich has more in common with Donald Trump and with Vladimir Putin than he does with you. That is just
a good point.
Objectively true. In terms of the status, in terms of the worldview, in terms of all those things, he's more closely aligned to Donald Trump than he is to you. So for all of this showmanship about what a horrible human Musk is, what a awful authoritarian Trump is, he's closer there than he is to you. So don't fall for his trap of trying to justify taking your voice away from you by liberating Twitter and to being more free speech heavy. That's just a ploy. Don't buy it. Even if you're the hardcore lefty, like, go back to being the free speech lefties of the the 60s or whatever. That's great. The 70s, protesting Vietnam. We'd be glad to have you. Let's join up there. Okay, next cringe post. Okay, we've got a post here with a first caption into an image that has a larger caption. The first caption reading, "This is why you're still renting for more than the monthly cost of a mortgage." And the bigger image reads, "Landlords don't provide housing. The entire point of landlording is to deny people housing by buying more housing than you need, thereby depleting the market supply, then renting your own hoarded excess back out to people who can't buy housing because you drove prices too high." Okay. Oh boy. So
this is the same guy that did the capitalist production.
Got it.
Post.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. We've got a true believer here. Let me start by saying there are a few cases where this could be correct if you look at something like Blackrock, where you get massive amounts of government bailout and funding, which Blackrock was, I believe, I could be mistaken here. I want to say it was at least one of the number one companies to benefit from the stimulus bill that was supposed to be the $1,200 checks and whatnot to the citizens. They pretended that that's what the bill was about, when in reality it was just massive amounts of bailouts for their buddies. I believe BlackRock was one of the top, if not the top recipient of those kinds of funds. So then BlackRock goes up buying housing, in ridiculous sum, again, propped up by the government. So I don't love what BlackRock is doing there. But as the principle, as the rule, not the exception, landlords do provide services. For one, not everyone wants to buy a house in a single area. They're not ready to. They need somewhere to live, and not everyone wants to necessarily live in an apartment. There are reasons. Right now, I'm renting a house, and eventually I do want to buy, but I don't want to buy a house in the specific area that I'm living, but I do want to live in a house here. The service that's provided me, one, is the ability to live in a house so that we have a yard, which is good for my dog, and we're in a nice neighborhood, which is great for me and my wife. And there are the ability to not be tied down to this one particular spot without having to buy and then sell and go through that whole process. And two, all of the maintenance and all of those costs go to the landlord because it's his property. He manages those things. He takes care of it. None of that is on my plate right now, except for things like lawn maintenance or whatever we've agreed to contractually. So no, landlords do provide a service. The other thing is that landlords can tend to manage properties as well. They're able to track what a property value should be worth, how a property can be maintained, and how you need to balance those things. And at a certain point, when a property is more valuable for the building to be demolished and rebuilt, those kinds of things, those services are provided by a landlord. Now, you may not like or agree with all of them, but not everyone needs to rent. You should have the ability, and in a greater free market where you don't have zoning restrictions or government funding a massive competitor to buy up houses, then you would have more option to not choose to rent if you wanted to buy. But before I pass to you, the one other thing that I'll say is that I was watching this documentary about Los Angeles and the way that it has been run and things like that. It was by G-Link, if anyone's interested. He just went to Odyssey, I think, as his home for his videos. So go check him out if you haven't already. And one of the interesting interviews that he did was there was this veteran who was homeless, and he'd been put through different government programs that were for housing, and he was saying how the government is more interested in getting you on a program so that they can call you out for not obeying their strict disciplinary of how you should live your life, so that they can kick you out and then they don't have to worry about you, kind of a thing, rather than actually setting people up for success. And there was this really nice apartment complex that was newly built, and they just put all of these homeless people in there thinking that would solve the problem. And he's like, someone like me, I can handle myself. I'm put together. I know how to live in an apartment. Some of these people have been homeless for 15 years. They don't know how to live into an apartment. The second day, someone tried to almost burn down the entire complex because they don't know how to live in an apartment. So all of that to say, there are services and there are reasons why landlords would deny housing to people. And it's because sometimes people don't show that they're going to be able to take care of something, and you end up with a ton of wasted potential that could have gone to a family who needs it, who can use it, who can take advantage. Now, I'm not saying that people like that shouldn't get taken care of. I think that there should be systems put in place, and again, communities are the best ones to address that. To know each individual homeless person or charity needing individual, they all are unique people with their own unique needs. One size fits all government programs do not work well for them. And so in order to say things like landlords just need to deny or are just here to deny and that's it, it's like, no, landlords have a duty to some degree to try to discern whether or not someone's going to be able to take care of something, because when you can have people taking care of that property, that actually helps everyone in the long run.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you took the like the Blackrock point, because that is kind of like the that is an actual example, right? Of a big corporation buying up housing and then like make it too expensive for people, and that's kind of one off. But like, let's in the absence of like a Federal Reserve or anyone printing money, that you couldn't have that really,
right?
And not in such a way that would damage the normal person as bad as it does, at least. I want to take on this guy's first statement, which is like, hey, like the reason why people rent for more than they would pay on a mortgage. And apparently this guy's never tried to take out a mortgage in his life, because the mortgage rate that you get is after you usually pay about 20 to 50% of the down payment for the house, right? So here in Seattle, if you wanted to live in Seattle, proper, and this is only really common in areas that are very like urban, right? Because there's a higher demand for housing and less of it. So if you don't really want to pay more for rent than a mortgage, probably just move out of the city. That's number one. That's a good way to kind of get away from that. But two, in Seattle, if you wanted to get like an apartment, like, yeah, it might cost like $4,500 a month to rent that apartment or whatever. But the value of that apartment, if you wanted to buy it, you'd have to put down like $300,000 or $400,000 to buy it, to have a $4,000 a month mortgage, right? And so renting is the service that it provides for people, is that people that don't have enough capital stored up to actually like put down a down payment or whatever on a house or an apartment or wherever are able to like have housing, right? Because none of us at any given time have enough resources to just make a house happen, right? And that's kind of the beauty of, lending capital and how it facilitates that, and time preference for interest and all those different things. The second thing that I want to say is like, let's apply this guy's logic to any other market. Let's just say like the restaurant industry. Chefs and restaurateurs don't provide food. The entire point of being a restaurateur is to deny people food by buying up more food than is in the market, so that they're hungry and they have to come to you. It's like, that's not how it works. It's absurd on its face than anywhere else, and it just kind of fits this narrative that the left has, especially here in Seattle, that they just hate property owners, right? Like, they basically decriminalized all property crimes here in Seattle. Not in Snohomish where I live, but definitely in Seattle. You can basically, unless you're being assaulted on your property, the cops aren't going to come. So they hate property ownership, and that's kind of what drives this narrative. But it's like apply that logic to anywhere, and you see, its flaws. And then the third thing I'll say is it's like there's obviously a or lack of understanding of like how the interest rate factors into all this stuff, right? Like, they don't understand the price of money. They don't understand how the Fed funds rate actually affects the market. And maybe you can get into that if you want. Or I think we've maybe talked about it a little bit. But it's like, all those things are why housing is so high, right? Like, there's not accurate pricing in the market. And so any property manager that is renting a house has to keep up with what the actual price could sell for, right? Because a house can be an investment for someone. And if the rate of return on that house is better served by selling it, that means there is no housing for people to rent. So in order to justify renting to someone, you actually have to charge higher rents, or else you're not being a good steward of the investment that you own.
Yeah, just talking about interest rates a little bit, I don't want to dive too deeply into it because we don't have so much time, but just to give sort of a brief primer. And if you are interested in learning more about this, I would highly recommend looking up some of the economic explanations from Bob Murphy in particular. I think he puts things in a very clear to understand way, and he's done some good stuff on just explaining Austrian business cycle theory, things like that. But to give a quick primer on the interest rate. So, when you borrow against a bank to say take out a loan to put down money for a mortgage, and then you're working you buy out the house, and then you're paying back this bank. you've put down X number of dollars, like you said, anywhere, like 20% or something of a house's value, and then you borrow the remaining sum from the bank in order to pay off that house to the owners, and then you're paying this bank back based on this mortgage, right? When you're doing that, you're factoring in an interest rate, right? So you take out this loan, and you're not just paying back the exact amount of a loan, right? As with most loans, there's an interest rate so that the entity which is giving you that money is making a profit in return for saying, okay, look, I don't have access to this money right now, so since I'm losing that time, you now will give me more money by the end of it, so that I am, that's why I'm loaning it to you, essentially. Without any interest, there's no reason why a bank or any other entity would want to give a loan out, right? Like, unless I just happen to have a soft spot for Brit, which friends often do, but if some random person comes up to me, I'm not just going to give him $50 and then have him give me $50 in a month. That I have no guarantee of it returning. There's no reason for that to happen, right? So that's why you have these interest rates. But the problem is that the Fed sets these interest rates in order to try to spur economic growth in one direction or the other. And so when you have really low interest rates, like we do right now, when you set them artificially low, it makes it really encouraged for people, and people are incentivized to take out loans and to do that, because in their spending models, the more people are spending money, the more this economy sort of gets built up and inflated, and people have money to spend, and so they buy things that they can't afford, and people speculate, and different properties look like they're worth more, or businesses get inflated because you have more capital to invest, and those kinds of things. What ends up happening is you're propping up this very, very fake economy, and eventually the interest rates go back up, and people aren't going to be able to take out loans, and then everything on this completely crashes, and you end up with the exact same kind of situation that you did with the first '08 big crash and the housing bubble burst and those kinds of things. So the problem with artificially manipulating these interest rates is that you're like Britt said earlier, you're not able to accurately see where lenders are in terms of what they're valuing their money return being at, right? Because if it's artificially pushed low and you're not able to accurately assess, maybe there's more risk, or you need your money now and you want it at a higher rate, it's worth more to you than it is to borrow than it was before. You need to raise those interest rates because that will make people less willing, or they'll pay you back at a higher return, whatever the case may be. Point is, it's a painful thing to raise interest rates after them being low, but it has to happen in order for the market to correct, and ideally it's not this artificially set deal from the Fed. So again, this is just kind of a really brief overview of it, and if you want a little bit more in-depth stuff, again, check out some people. Mises.org is a great resource, but like I said, Bob Murphy in general, in particular, if you've got the time for it, Jordan Peterson on hosting Bob Murphy on his podcast, I think was a really great explanation of a bunch of different Austrian concepts, including this. So go check out that episode if you've got any interest in that. But yeah, so all that being said, yeah, no, you're fine. I'm just gonna say, all that being said, the housing situation right now it's complicated, but it's also not. It's like there's a lot of factors, but at the end of the day, the government has overplayed its hand in many ways, where it's paid companies to do shady practices, and then it's artificially set interest rates low to encourage people to take out loans, which is why house prices are so high right now too. Okay, our next cringe post here looks like a conversation between two people here on Twitter, and the first person is asking, and I'm guessing this is in response to sort of a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour, and so they ask, so a high school junior should make $15 per hour? And this other person replies, yep, because wages are about the cost of labor, not your opinion about its value. If you get the kid's labor, but he still can't feed himself, the taxpayers make up the difference, which means we subsidize your stinginess. We don't make laws based on what we assume a worker's life situation is. We have child labor laws that address the age at which someone can or should earn a wage. Once they are workers, they are the same under the law. So yeah, exploiting young people is kind of morally bankrupt anyway. Well, goodness, I guess, that's it. That defeats the idea. Wages are about the cost of labor, not about our opinion of its value, I suppose. He just asserts it. He doesn't, his claim is that if the kid can't feed himself, taxpayers make up the difference. But that's just such an arbitrary thing. One, okay, let's get rid of the law, any sort of subsidies for the poor, any sort of welfare programs. Okay, now your argument doesn't make sense because that social safety net is gone, so taxpayers don't subsidize it. So just because of the way that things are does not mean that that's the way that things ought to be, or that the way that value is perceived. That's just such a weird thing to say. In the same way where it's like, I don't know, I shouldn't egg Britt's house because he's standing outside and he sees me. And so if I egg his house and he sees me, he'll chase me away. But if Britt's not standing there, I suppose it's okay for me to egg his house now. Like, it's stupid. Like, the circumstantial law aspect of it being interchangeable or not, it doesn't make sense as to determining what the value of someone's labor is, whether or not taxpayers subsidize something or not. That's just a weird way to justify that. I don't really understand his argument. Maybe you have a little bit more insight on what he's talking about. Like, we don't make laws based on what we assume a worker's life situation is, or any. Take a stab at any of it. But
yeah, so he's trying to say right there, he's like, it's based on a flawed proposition, which is that the minimum wage should be what covers a person's minimal level of comfort or lifestyle, right? And so he's like, we can't make a law based on, we assume that this person shouldn't have TiVo or whatever it is, right? Like that's what he's trying to say there, which is utterly ridiculous. I want to go back though to, because wages are about the cost of labor. And this is what's so funny about minimum wage, folks, is like, well, what is the cost? How do you determine what that is?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, the cost is what it costs. It's like Jan from The Office when Michael's like, I don't want to spend this on curtains. It costs what it costs. Contrary to what this person says, the cost of labor or the value of labor is actually subjective, right? Like, under this argument, you could say someone that goes into, produce X widgets, if they go in and produce the widget, but they don't actually produce anything, they just sit there and watch the widgets run by on the assembly line because their labor, their lifestyle costs this much, they should get paid X amount of dollars. It's like, no, like that person gets fired because they're not producing more than what it's called pulling your own weight, right? Like one of my favorite examples of this, Peter Schiff was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and Joe Rogan is kind of a fan of the minimum wage in some ways. And Peter Schiff's like, well, what if you have someone that is paid $7.50 an hour, but they don't produce $7.51 an hour? Like, how could you keep employing that person? Like, it's not feasible, right? That person isn't pulling their weight. And you can't have a business where there's more money going out than there's coming in. And that's just kind of like the reality of itself. It doesn't matter if the kid can't feed himself. I mean, I'm obviously sympathetic to someone who's going to starve or anything like that. But it's like that person probably needs to work 2 jobs, right? If they can't feed themselves off of one job, or if the value of their skill set isn't enough to produce enough value to feed themselves, right? Like they need to do some other things. They need to not work 40 hours a week. They probably need to work 60 hours a week. And Jordan Peterson had this really fantastic post or tweet thread earlier this week just about like construction, right? He's like, people don't realize how difficult construction is, what a miracle it is for a bridge to be built, what a miracle it is for a building to be built, that there are people doing impossible things every day to make these things happen. But by the beauty of the free market, they have a lot of tools now that make it possible to have a 40-hour work weekend for a building to go up. But it's like there's a very clear like input and output of labor, and you have to have more. You have to have more output than your input for there to be things left over for people to have food, right? And that's just a fact of reality. It's like any principle in physics, right? Like you can calculate the math on it. Like if you're a farmer and you go and produce X amount of wheat, and that X amount of wheat, there's not enough to actually like left over after you've done like giving it away to people or whatever to feed your family, like there's going to definitely be less wheat next year because there's going to be a couple people that die, right? Because people are going to starve to death. And so these people are the same type of people that will like demonize profit when it's like, in fact, profit is the only reason we have what, are able to enjoy the luxuries we have today.
I think the other weird thing I see about this is when this person is such a stickler and so emphasizing this idea that wages are about the cost of labor and not the opinion about its value. Well, what if the cost of labor is under $15, but I still want to hire someone? Are you going to emphasize then?
That's a great point.
I'm confused by that because it seems like such a double standard to say that wages have to directly correlate to something that's not subjective value. But again, if it's an objective value, what if it's objectively not worth $15? So, I think a great example of that is many internship programs. There's a reason why internships usually aren't paid, and it's because the value they're ideally providing. I'm not saying this is the case with every internship, but ideally you're able to train someone and give them experience and let them learn. And the thing is, interns, like most of the time, or a lot of the time at least, they kind of suck at what you're telling them to do. And the reason why they are not paid, or sometimes they are paid, but are paid a minimum rate of some kind, is because they're not providing that value. And you doing that internship program, the benefit is, yeah, we're investing some of our resources into training them and making their skill set better, and they're able to learn. And in exchange, we get some not very valuable labor for free. Now, where I work, we actually pay interns, and we hope to get some level of output back. But to be honest, the level that we pay those interns is probably higher than than some of the value that they're creating. And so if we're going by this person's logic, each intern should really only be paid directly correlated with the value that they are creating in that individual spot. So if you hired someone, I think the other example that I always use about this is if you're hiring someone who lacks the mental faculties for higher tiered work of some kind, especially if they're actually mentally handicapped or something like that. Oftentimes businesses like to hire people like that to do cleaning or to do simple tasks that are, within their capacity to do. But a business can't do that if they're forced to pay more than that labor is worth. And so what ends up happening is those people get hurt the most, because when you hire someone to do some simple cleaning around your store, but they're not able to multitask or they're not able to handle multiple kinds of jobs there, they're only creating value of, let's say, $7 an hour when the minimum wage is $15. And so in order to hire that person, the business now has to take an over 50% loss on that employee for every hour that they work. And that just means that those people get left out and they don't get to get hired, because the objective value that they're providing, if you want to use the cost of labor or whatever, is completely disproportionate.
I want to say one last thing on it, because I thought of a good example. But think a lot of these issues would be solved if you just think from the perspective of being a business owner, which I know is very difficult for a lot of these types of people. But just think about it from the perspective, you're a business owner. Maybe you make $100,000 in revenue per year, and you're 30% margin. So you're taking home $30K in profit for you to own. And you're like, well, I want to grow, so I'm going to hire a salesperson, and I'm going to pay this salesperson $50,000 a year to sell my stuff. If that salesperson doesn't sell at least, $150,000 worth of product, you are losing money, right? Like, what do you think is going to happen in 3 years if you keep that salesperson on and they are generating less money than what they are paid in terms of margin, less money than what they're paid? Like, you're going to go out of business. The extra $30,000 that you take home for yourself to feed your family, is not going to be there, right? It went to go pay someone else to do a job where they're not pulling their weight. So a lot of these issues are just solved if someone, and that's why I think it's so important for someone to try to start their own business or try and do something, because then you realize I make directly in proportion to the value that I generate, regardless. And that's why salespeople, good salespeople, get paid so much, right? So if you are selling $3 million worth of services every year and you're generating $400,000 or $500,000 in profit for your employer, chances are you'll probably make $250,000, $300,000. You'll make a lot of money because you can directly tie how much value you're bringing. And that same principle, though, applies to the person sweeping the grocery store, to the same person at the checkout stand. And that's usually why those fixed jobs don't pay very much, because your value doesn't actually scale very well.
Well said. Well said. Okay,
you want to play this
our
video?
last cringe post is this video we've got here, and it's questioning at a college from a panel, and on this panel are different journalists, including one Brian Stelter from CNN. So we'll play the clip and then we'll remark after that.
I'm a first year at the college. My question is for Mr. Seltzer. You've all spoken extensively about Fox News being a purveyor of disinformation, but CNN is right up there with them. They pushed the Russian collusion hoax. They pushed the Jussie Smollett hoax. They smeared Justice Kavanaugh as a rapist, and they also smeared Nick Sandmann as a white supremacist. And yes, they dismissed the Hunter Biden laptop affair as pure Russian disinformation. With mainstream corporate journalists becoming little more than apologists and cheerleaders for the regime, is it time to finally declare that the canon of journalistic ethics is dead or no longer operative? Stakes of the mainstream media, and CNN in particular, seem to magically all go in one direction. Are we expected to believe that this is all just some sort of random coincidence, or is there something else behind it?
It's too bad. It's time for lunch.
You have 30 seconds.
No, I mean,
Brian.
there's a clock that says 30 seconds. But I think my honest answer to you, and I'll come over and talk in more detail after this, is that I think you're describing a different channel than the one that I watch. But I understand that that is a popular right-wing narrative about CNN. I think it's important when we talk about shared reality and democracy, all these networks, all these news outlets have to defend democracy. And when they screw up, admit it. But when Benjamin Hall, the Fox correspondent, was wounded in Ukraine, the news crews at CNN and the New York Times stopped what they were doing, and they tried to help. They tried to help him get out of the country. They tried to find the dead crew members. That's what news outlets do. That's how they actually do work together, to your question about sharing those kinds of connections and trust. We don't talk about it enough, though. We don't share that reality about how that happens. And with regards to the regime, I think you mean President Biden. The last time I spoke with a Biden aide, we yelled at each other. So that's the reality of the news business that people don't see, that people don't hear. They imagine that it's a situation that it simply is not. But I think your question, it speaks to the failure of journalism to show our work and show the reality of how our profession operates. We have a lot of work to do, I think.
My goodness, that is just, it's such a bad non-answer from Brian Stelter in so many ways. First thing I'll point out, his little stupid joke about, time for lunch, and, well, no, there's a clock that says I have 30 seconds. He bides about 8 seconds of his 30-second clock in stalling out there. So that's really obvious for the first thing. Two, the examples that the kid gives for the questions, I think that a few of them are pretty demonstrably true. Kavanaugh, you could technically still have your reservations about, but I think it's been pretty thoroughly shown that at least some of the hoaxes that CNN pushed from some of the accusations were completely false, and they never really denounced. But even if you took that one out there, even if Kavanaugh makes you squirm or whatever, things like the Russian collusion was proved to be a hoax. Things like Nicholas Sandmann they settled outside of court. So CNN did not want to take it to court. That's how wrong they were. The Hunter Biden laptop also. So there's like these very concrete examples he gives, and what he says is that's a right-wing talking point. It's not the CNN I know, and we need to defend democracy and admit when we're wrong. And he does not admit when he's wrong in any of those demonstrably wrong cases.
Yeah, that's what I was going to point out. So like when he said, "Oh, it's almost time for lunch," I was like, "Oh, maybe we'll get an honest answer," because that's usually indicative of like, "Oh, I don't actually want to answer this question because it's kind of embarrassing." So I was like, "Okay, sweet. Maybe we'll get a moment of truth and honesty from this guy." Something that I don't think I've seen from him ever in his whole career. And but no, he goes into exactly like you said, deflecting. Like it's like almost like a politician answer, like, which is what's really weird. It's like, how can I say as much as I can in this 30 seconds without actually saying anything? And my favorite part, and it sucks that it cut out there, and maybe we'll have to like link to the video or something so people can go look at it if they haven't heard it. But like when you look at his face on it, when he's about to go into the thing about like, oh, we had the reporter and we took care of him and we all banded together. Like you literally see like NPC autopilot turn on because he's like, oh crap, I've got 5 seconds still left. And in my non-answer, what am I going to say? Pivot to virtue signal, and that's what he does. Like he literally like thinks, like you could see it in his face as he does it. And it's just like, how do you think, man? Like that answer that you said nothing in, and especially didn't admit you were wrong about any of the things the guy said, like. How do you think that's going to play, right? Like, it would have been way better for you to just say, "Hey, you're right. We got all 4 of those stories wrong, and we're trying to do better." And that still would have been kind of cringy because it's like, okay, we're trying to do better, but like, show me the actions. But it's like, at least admit you're wrong, right? Like, at least that's a little bit honest. I just wish that in some of these panels that like these kids, like, props to that kid for nailing him. Like, he really did a good job. But I wish they had someone after him. Like they'd gone up in a pair, and so there was the kid that asked the question, Stelter gives his non-answer, and then the kid follows up and says, hey, you didn't actually answer the question. And then it's like he's got to come up with another 30 seconds of bullcrap, to spew. And it's just, I don't understand how anyone can like watch those networks and not transparently see through it, right? Like that is like, you've clearly got 2 ideas put up. You've got a set of facts, and then you've got someone's response to those, and it's clear that they don't want to actually like engage with it. And for the news network of facts, Brian Stelter, the guy that keeps the media honest, to not be able to do that. Like if you're the best they have in terms of honesty and truth and all those things, then I'd say it's pretty bad over there.
To go back to the point you made earlier about it being a will to power rather than an aspect of principle. That's the difference and the revealing trait of so many of the regime types. And no, I don't mean the Biden administration. I mean the regime. This is apparent when you look at the debate between Scott Horton and Bill Kristol, or this panel right here, or any of these examples of places where official spokespeople are put on the spot and they're asked questions by people who have real questions. They're not these pre-programmed, pre-telegraphed, DNC writing the debate questions for Hillary Clinton level type interrogations where they don't have real answers because there's not even a principle they can go back to. So, sometimes when you're put on the spot with a question and you're not prepared with the data and the facts, you can get caught off guard. And ideally, that someone who would be considered an expert, like Bill Kristol in his field or Brian Stelter in his, you would have those facts because that's what you do for a living. But I get it. Not everyone in every scenario is going to come prepared with that kind of stuff for every single question. So you should always be able to fall back on a principle. And the problem is in this case, with Bill Kristol, he goes, the Balkans was a successful intervention, which was a terrible one. And Scott Horton tells why that also doesn't work or whatever. But I think in that case, he should have pointed to the Balkans and then said, but even if these particular examples were disastrous, this is why this ideology is worth defending or something like that. You should always be able to go back to the principle. Or in Brian Stelter's case, you should be able to say, in these cases, well, we dispute that, but I think the bigger issue is CNN keeps its journalistic practices up to snuff. We make sure that we're not using bad sources like Fox News does. This is why, we call Fox News disinformation and spreading these things, whereas with CNN, we can go back and forth on the details of these particular things, whether they were right or wrong, but ultimately the principle here would be that CNN keeps itself up to journalistic standards or something like that. That's what you should always be able to go back to if you actually have a principle. If you're sort of in a gotcha moment when it comes to particular facts or instances that you don't have the answer to, you should always be able to answer with your principle. And he wasn't even able to do that because they don't have a principle at CNN.
Well, he did kind of, right? Like his principle is whatever makes me look good, and the regime that I want to look good is what I'm going to say.
And democracy. And democracy.
Yeah. Yes, democracy. And that's like his principle's on full display, right? It's like pivot to an example that makes me look good and my network look good, not to an answer that like actually reveals how we do things. I think that's a fantastic point, man. And I've not really thought about it that way. That's like, yeah, you can't always be. No one is going to be prepared with every single fact or piece of data out there. But the difference between people like that and people I think like us is that we have a principle that we're able to like analyze data as it comes in against, right? And that's why so many libertarians are pretty good debaters and and are pretty good at discussion, I'd say.
Yeah. So the only other thing I will add on to all this is just the complete lack of awareness from him when he says that we need to defend democracy, because that to me is just such a funny thing to throw in there, because he says, well, we need to defend democracy and call ourselves out when we're wrong. But what did the democracy line have to do with anything? I'm genuinely curious. It seems like that to me almost is the most dead giveaway, where he's just like, he has a tick, like you're talking about with his face going on autopilot. That's like his verbal tick. He's got his facial tick and he's got his verbal tick.
Yeah.
And in the same way that I have verbal ticks, I say too much, or I might say like too much. His verbal tick is defend democracy. Gotta defend democracy. Gotta democracy. But Putin, Trump, democracy. That's his filler word. Okay.
Love it.
Anyway, I think that's it for us for this show. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Again, if you want to leave a comment, like and share and subscribe, all that jazz, we really appreciate it. And we will catch you on the next one.